With the leave of the House, we will take clauses 19 to 23 together. The question is that clauses 19 to 23 stand part of the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We continue with Amendment 118 to Clause 24, with which it will be convenient to debate Amendment 5 to Clause 24. That Clause 24 stand part of the bill. Amendments 119, 7 and 6 to Clause 25. That Clause 25 stand part of the bill. And new clauses 28, 39, 40, 44, 45, 46, 53 and 55. Angus Robertson to move Amendment 118.
It's Eilidh Whiteford.
Eilidh Whiteford to move Amendment 118.
Thank you, Mr Cosby. I'm glad that that confusion's not going to stand. I'm very pleased to be able to move Amendments 118 and 119 this afternoon, as well as new clauses 40, 44, 45 and 46, all of which relate to universal credit and further powers over social security. Throughout debate on this Scotland Bill, its failure to enact properly the recommendations of the Smith Commission has been the key point of contention, and I'm very conscious that these shortcomings are nowhere more acutely evident than in this section of the bill. The Smith Agreement was crystal clear in paragraphs 43 to 48 that although universal credit was to remain a reserved benefit, the Scottish Parliament should have specific powers and responsibilities, most notably, and I quote, power to change the frequency of universal credit payments, vary the existing plans for single household payments and pay landlords direct for housing costs in Scotland. It also says the Scottish Parliament will have the power to vary the housing cost elements of universal credit, including varying the under-occupancy charge and local housing allowances rates, eligible rent and deductions for non-dependents. Mr Cosby, the dispute over whether the Scotland Bill as it stands delivers on the Smith Agreement was well aired at second reading. An Amendment 118, which I intend to push to a vote today, and Amendment 119 would put this issue to bed once and for all. These amendments remove from the bill the requirement for the Scottish Government to obtain consent from a UK Secretary of State in relation to universal credit before exercising their new powers. New Clause 44 would devolve all working age benefits to the Scottish Parliament. New Clause 45 would broaden the Scottish Parliament's administrative flexibilities over universal credit. And New Clause 46 would devolve child benefit and responsibility for the conditionality and sanctions regime. It's very important that this House understands how this dispute is perceived in Scotland by elected parliamentarians and by wider civil society. The cross-party Scottish Parliament Devolution Further Powers Committee that considered this legislation didn't mince its words on this front. In paragraph 318 of their interim report, they expressed concerns with a number of the welfare provisions, and they said that, and I quote, the relevant clauses do not yet meet the spirit and substance of the Smith Commission's recommendations and potentially pose challenges in any attempt to implement them. I hope members opposite realise that this was the view shared by their Conservative colleagues in the Scottish Parliament, who were properly represented on that committee. The committee suggested that this issue and the form of words should be resolved between the two governments before introduction of the bill. However, that just hasn't happened. The Scottish Government made proposals to the UK Government for alternative approaches to ensure intergovernmental working was effective, but there's been no progress. And consequently, this aspect of the bill has not changed. Therefore, it's very important that we address this today, and that's what our amendments seek to do. A number of key stakeholder organisations in Scotland have been outspoken in setting out their concerns about the current wording of the bill and have helped to highlight exactly why we need those powers in Scotland and what we could do with them. The WISE Group, for example, has argued that the power to split universal credit payments within households, to increase the frequency of payments and to make housing element payments direct to landlords will allow the flexibility in benefit payments to fit with the needs of some of the most vulnerable groups in society. The Poverty Alliance has expressed disappointment over what they say is ultimately a veto given to the Secretary of State over any future changes to the devolved elements of universal credit by the Scottish Government. Inclusion Scotland has pointed out that the bill as it stands could result in delays to the implementation of mitigation policies agreed by the Scottish Parliament. They also say that this may not be consistent with the spirit of the Smith Commission, which implies that the devolved welfare powers can be exercised without the need to obtain prior permission from the DWP. Citizens Advice Scotland has also concluded that the clauses do require the Scottish Government to consult the UK Government and to gain their agreement to the timing of any variance. They argue that enabling the UK Secretary of State to make regulations in an area which is devolved to the Scottish Parliament without its consent does not appear to be consistent with the Smith Commission agreement that the Sewell Convention should be put on a statutory footing. They say that whilst the intention appears that the timing of any changes needs to be subject to negotiation on what's practically possible to do, there's scope for wide interpretation of the circumstances that might be considered reasonable for the Secretary of State to withhold their agreement to the Scottish Government utilising their devolved power to make regulations in this area. When I spoke earlier this afternoon, I highlighted the letter in this morning's Herald from 12 of Scotland's leading third sector organisations that it was time to coincide with today's debate and ahead of the emergency budget a week on Wednesday. It expresses grave concerns about the severe detrimental impact the government's austerity measures are having on low and middle income households, and highlight in particular the threat to tax credits and other support that would fall within universal credit. The issue in Scotland is that 2/3 of the people in receipt of those tax credits are people in work. Most of the children living in poverty in Scotland are people with parents in work. So our biggest challenge is low pay and how we tackle that. And these powers, were they to be given without that veto, would enable us to tackle these long-term problems that hold back our economic growth and hold back the development of our economy. But the challenge, I will give way briefly.
I'm most grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I'm listening with great attention to what she's saying. But it does seem to me that if one is able to better control universal tax credits, which was effectively a sop to employers to pay lower wages, thereby depressing the wage market introduced by a previous government, if those are started to be reined back, then employers will be forced, just in the court of public opinion, to pay more. Thereby you solve the problem, but you solve problems from the employer's side of the argument rather than from the taxpayers.
If the Honourable Gentleman is proposing that we start paying people a living wage and ensure that the minimum wage actually meets a living wage that people can actually live on, then I couldn't agree with him more. And fundamentally, until we have living wages, we're always going to be in a position where those in low and middle income families are living below the breadline and struggling to make ends meet. But the fundamental point, and I think the challenge that those 12 organisations put to those of us in this House is, I will in just a second, but the challenge that they pose to us is that as we begin the process of defining the shape of Scotland's social security system, we need to understand just how high the stakes are for people who have been struggling now for a number of years and are seeing their incomes reducing in real terms. And I will give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'm really impressed by the speech she's given, and I'm obviously listening to it quite intently. But is it true that the SNP voted against, 5 times voted against, putting the living wage as a requirement into the public procurement bill?
The Honourable Lady is mistaken in that assumption, because the issue there is that the procurement legislation was hampered by EU legislation that currently prevents us from doing that. However, what the Scottish Government has been able to do in recent public sector contracts is ensure that those living wage requirements have been integrated into those contracts at the outset, so that in fact now all the people for whom the Scottish Government is responsible are on a living wage. I think there are still many challenges, particularly at local authority level with contracted out services, but as we move forward I think we are trying very hard to make sure that in all parts of the public sector we're moving towards a living wage, and we've made some real progress in recent months in terms of the private sector and making sure that more private sector employers are moving towards a living wage, because let's face it, it's in the private sector that most of those low paid jobs are to be found, and what we really need is the power to put the minimum wage up to a living standard, because we also know that those people on low incomes, when they have money in their pockets, spend it, and it actually boosts the economy. It actually strengthens the economy, it creates jobs. We saw that when the minimum wage was introduced. But I think it's absolutely incumbent on every single one of us in this House to listen to the voices of those people in Scotland who've put their heads over the parapet on this issue, because they are some of Scotland's largest and most influential civil society organisations. And I think it's worth noting who they are. Citizens Advice Scotland, Bernardo's Scotland, the Child Poverty Action Group, the Church of Scotland, Inclusion Scotland, One Parent Families Scotland, the Poverty Allowance, the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, Shelter Scotland, the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, the Trussell Trust, and last but by no means least, the STUC. The veto in the Scotland Bill is a barrier to responsive and responsible governance in Scotland. I will give way.
Grateful. If the Scottish Government did have wide-ranging powers in welfare as she would like, by how much would they need to put the benefits up compared with the UK levels to tackle the problem she's drawn up?
Well, gentleman asks a very interesting point. I think it's really worth pointing out to him that over the last 5 years, in Scotland, we've spent a lower proportion of our GDP on pensions and benefits than the UK as a whole, because the whole question of what you can afford in a social security system is dependent on how successful your economy is. And that's why the amendments that we've tabled to this bill are all designed to bring into the ambit of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament those powers that would enable us to grow our economy, run it more effectively, and join up those existing devolved powers with the new powers that we propose. And frankly, getting powers over work and powers over the benefits covered by universal credit are extremely important. The other really important point of that is that we protect the most disadvantaged people in our society from the onslaught of Tory cuts, because people in Scotland have made it clear again and again that they want an alternative to this austerity regime, and that's what we want to be in a position to deliver. Mr Cosby, the Deputy First Minister John Swinney pointed out that it's not very difficult to foresee that what might appear to be pretty innocuous requirements to consult the Secretary of State and secure his or her agreement could be translated into what is essentially a blocking power, because all sorts of excuses could be used to prevent something from happening. As he put it, if that minister has a reasonable explanation of why they're doing that, that passes the test as it currently exists in the clause. In practice, the bill gives the UK Government the ability to veto decisions made by the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament. And this is not a hypothetical scenario. The Deputy First Minister has pointed out how he spent 2 years trying to make progress on the block grant adjustment, being stalled and delayed with more analysis at every turn by the UK Government. But for me, no issue illustrates the shortcoming of this Scotland Bill better than the restrictions it would place on the power of the Scottish Parliament to abolish the bedroom tax. Now, as the Secretary of State knows only too well, this has been an issue close to my heart for the last few years because of its punitive impact on disabled people in Scotland, its gross unfairness and the enormous pressure it puts on councils and other social housing providers. In Scotland, 80% of the people affected by the bedroom tax were in homes with a disabled adult. And there's a chronic mismatch between the house size requirements of tenants and the available housing stock. Back in April 2013, I led one of the SNP's very few Opposition Day debates here in this chamber in the last Parliament on this topic. And the Secretary of State knows that I questioned him on several occasions about the failure of this policy and its deep unpopularity right across the country. The Scottish Government has mitigated the impact of the bedroom tax by providing discretionary housing payments to everyone affected, but it's important to recognise that we still cannot abolish that legislation, and it remains on the statute book. Moreover, the money to mitigate its worst side effects is to be found from other devolved policy budgets, and crucially, the legal liability remains with tenants. It's far from an ideal solution. But in order to mitigate the bedroom tax by lifting the cap on discretionary housing payments, the Scottish Government first had to secure the permission of the UK Government. And Mr Cosby, the protracted and frustrating process they encountered in attempting to secure that permission illustrates, I think, perfectly why we need to lift this veto and how a need for permission can be drawn out for months at a time. I'm happy to give way to the Secretary of State.
I obviously know the Honourable Lady's points on this issue, but even the First Minister acknowledges that the point from which a request was made to increase the cap to the legislation reaching the Privy Council was achieved in record level, and it was achieved by the two governments working very closely together on a matter like this, which they can do on so many occasions.
The Secretary of State and I have a different perception of time frames and what they mean to people living on limited incomes, because when the Scottish Government sought permission to raise the cap on DHPs, the UK Government used exactly the kind of blocking and delaying tactics that will be left open by the Scotland Bill. These are not theoretical worst-case scenarios. I say to you, I'd like to refresh the Secretary of State's memory, because it was early in 2014 that the Scottish Government first sought the UK Government's permission to lift the cap on DHPs, and I raised the issue on more than one occasion in this House after that. And in fact, it took until May for the Government to grant permission, something that could have been done overnight. Most of the public organisations that I deal with in my capacity as an MP have a 21-day turnaround on these issues, and yet the Government opposite take months at a time. That's a long time if you're living on your uppers and struggling with your income. And I will give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful, Honourable Lady, for giving way. You made a fantastic speech. But isn't it absolutely amazing to hear the nanny-esque statements coming from the Conservative front bench about giving a government or a parliament permission? That's the sort of thing they would not tolerate themselves, which was from the European Commission or from the French government or the German government. But they expect the Scottish government to come cap in hand to Westminster when they want to do the decent thing for people. Ridiculous.
Gentleman, I think, makes a very pertinent point. But during those intervening months between that simple request and getting the permission that we needed, some of our most disadvantaged citizens continued to accrue rent arrears, and they had to do without essentials in order to meet their liabilities. And that's just one very concrete example of how restrictions of this type currently act as a stalling mechanism and a barrier to progressive change. And they demonstrate why we need to get rid of the veto. Other examples of things that we could do with these provisions include the power to maintain direct payments of housing benefit to social landlords, something which I think is in everybody's interests, or the power to ensure that under universal credit claimants can receive individual payments. That's something that potentially benefits women and children and protects their interests. Or indeed the power to equalise the earnings disregard between the first and second earners in a household. Again, given the persistent pay gap in Scotland between women and men, that's a measure that would predominantly benefit up to 70,000 women by up to £1,200 a year. By contrast, if we leave this bill unamended, we curtail the powers of the Scottish Parliament to enact policies that are overwhelmingly in the interests of our citizens and supported by them, and we see measures like these being batted off into the long grass. We also store up trouble down the line. I think, Mr Crosbie, it's fair to say that the Secretary of State got himself into a recurrent earlier this month on the Scotland 2015 programme when he was asked directly about this veto. When the presenter put it to him that it could be used to block if there was a political will to do that, because who would decide if the Secretary of State was unreasonably withholding consent, the Secretary of State, and I quote him directly, said, "Well, I would hope that it would never come to that, but because it's on the face of the legislation, it ultimately might be for the courts that would decide." Mr Crosbie, I fear that the Secretary of State has let the cat out of the bag. I suspect he was a lot more candid than he intended to be. And I think we can infer from that very revealing remark that he knows, in practice, this bill's measures will act as a veto on the Scottish Parliament, pure and simple. But I put it to the House that if the Scottish Parliament has to go to court to enforce the powers devolved in this bill, then it's not worth the paper that it is written. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the honourable lady, which also accept that there's a potential constitutional point here as well, and because what is being suggested is in effect a breach of the Sewell Convention, whereby power is given on the one hand, but it's possibly taken away with the other.
I think that's a very astute point to make, and it does show that if we get ourselves into a muddle with legislation, if it is just a kern, then we are storing up trouble down the line, because the legislation has to be future-proof as well as present-proof, and we have to prepare for every eventuality. And we can dance around the semantics of the current wording of the bill all afternoon. But if Scottish ministers have to obtain the agreement from UK ministers on when their measures are to take effect, that is, in effect, handing the UK the ability to block or delay the implementation of policy, frustrating the legitimate democratic process and contravening both the letter and the spirit of the Smith Agreement. If they have to go to court to enforce these measures, then it should be obvious that these measures are less than adequate. If the Secretary of State still maintains that there is no veto, I challenge him to accept Amendments 118 and 119, which make that explicit and beyond all doubt.
Why do you want them in?
Mr Cosby, this group of amendments comes... I won't give way, I'm just winding up my remarks. This group of amendments comes down to respect. Respect for the promises that were made to the people of Scotland, respect for our Parliament, respect for the democratic process, and above all, respect for our citizens themselves and our ability to make decisions in our own interests. That is, after all, Mr Cosby, what meaningful devolution is really all about.
The question is that Amendment 118 be made. John Redwood.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I think this House wants to implement the spirit and the letter of Smith, and I look forward to hearing the responses of the Secretary of State to the detailed points just advanced by the Honourable Lady speaking for Scottish Nationalists. But I think when we're dealing with something that's potentially wide-ranging as universal credit, we do need to think too about the money, and we need to think about how far you can go in a country like the United Kingdom in having a very different system of welfare in different parts of the country. Because what we've seen in the unfolding and dreadful Greek crisis is that if a country belongs to a currency union with other countries, but it has not brought its benefit system into line and there isn't a proper system of sharing revenues and expenditures across the whole of the Eurozone, then it does become extremely damaging for the poor Greeks.
Should the honourable member isn't suggesting that there is an in-line benefit system across Europe, and the real problem with Greece is austerity, because they were told 5 years ago if they followed austerity their problems would end, and their problems haven't ended. They've got worse because austerity makes things worse, and it's nothing to do with welfare, it's to do with austerity.
Exactly. Welfare has quite a lot to do with austerity, and I think we agree. And I think that the policies forced upon Greece have been too austere, that it is quite wrong to make them cut public spending when they cannot expand their money supply, they cannot expand credit and expand the private sector to create the jobs that you would clearly need in order to make some success out of the cuts imposed upon the public sector. And when we conducted policy since 2010 with the coalition to get recovery in Britain, including in Scotland, it's worked very well. It was private sector led, and we were able to do so because we had a full range of powers over interest rates, money creation, credit and banking, which a nation that has joined a currency union doesn't have. And that is the Greek tragedy, that they're only able to do the public sector part of the EU fix, which is the bit that is austere, and they're not able to do the private sector-led recovery. But we're not here to talk about Greece, we're here to talk about our currency union. I just wish to make that point, because whereas Greece is having to go from a position where it just shares a currency and is discovering it needs to share a lot of other policies with the European Union in order to make a success of it, in Scotland things are going the other way, that we have a currency union, perfectly good currency union, which is supported on all sides. The SNP, I believe, are great fans of the currency union and don't wish to have an independent currency for Scotland. But I just think that they need to consider, if they do not want proper independence for having their own currency, then in order to make the currency work in the way that it has done in the past, there do have to be some basic standards of welfare that are common across the country, and there have to be agreed systems of transferring money from rich areas to poor areas. Now, there are rich towns and cities in Scotland and in England, and the rule of our system is that whoever has areas of high income or relative success pays more tax, and whichever area or town or county has a lot of poverty gets big transfers. I give way.
I almost feel sorry that I am interrupting him whilst he's making a good argument for the redistribution of wealth through taxation, which is a very good thing, as well as his admission that austerity is not a good idea. But the mention of Greece, I think, is erroneous here. For the currency zone and the currency union, the optimal currency zone, better parallel would be Germany and the Netherlands. And the sort of independence that Germany and the Netherlands have from each other would be very welcome on these benches. And I would hope he would go a little bit further in his enlightened remarks so far and would agree with us that Scotland and England should be Germany and the Netherlands.
I'm not prepared to go that far, and I think there can be problems in the euro currency zone between Germany and the Netherlands because they don't have the full range of common policies that they might need. At the moment, it looks as if the Dutch and the German economy are sufficiently synchronised, so it isn't causing problems in the Netherlands. But that is clearly not true for Portugal or Spain or Ireland or Greece. And it implies, because there are more countries that it doesn't fit than do fit, there is something wrong with the fundamental architecture of the euro. But that is why I'm very concerned that when we debate properly today the issue of how much welfare discretion there is, we bear in mind that one of the characteristics of successful currency unions is that you normally have a common welfare system. And yes, I do believe in redistribution. We all believe in redistribution. We believe that in a civilized country like our own, we tax the rich more and we give money to those who need support. We have arguments about how much and the conditions, but we all believe in transfers, and we believe that you need to get that right balance. When I asked the Honourable Lady to say how much more an enlightened Scot give by means of welfare payments to tackle immediate problems of low income or poverty, she wasn't able to tell me, and I think that was a pity, because I took it that her intervention and the purpose of these amendments was to give the Scottish Executive power to increase benefit levels compared with the benefit levels or the range of benefits that is currently on offer in the Union. I didn't think they were seeking these powers to be meaner than the Union government is proposing to be, and I see them consenting with that. So I think this debate would be richer and fuller if they would share with us how much extra they would like to spend.
It's for whatever Scottish Government of whatever colour to decide how it wants to use the Parliament. Perhaps one day a party of his colour, and it can use these powers. But it won't be able to use any of the powers that are vetoed by the Secretary of State.
Well, that gets us back to this very, very important and interesting point. At what point does transfer of power become destabilising for the currency union and the common transfers that make up our common country? And that surely is one of the things that was examined in the referendum, where a majority of Scottish people felt that they wanted to stay with the United Kingdom and with the currency union. I suspect from reading and listening to those actively involved in the debate that the currency union was rather central to the securing of that vote, and I think it was perhaps when the parties of the union said that Scotland should leave the currency as well as leaving the UK if that was the wish of the Scottish people, that probably meant the majority of Scottish people voted to stay in the Union. I give way.
No, what size of the changes in welfare spending would he find destabilising? Given that the Honourable Member for Gainsborough said yesterday that the Scottish Parliament spends $37 billion and raises $30 billion, which he described as being quite responsible. And he also showed that the UK raised staggeringly more at $648 billion, was about 20 times greater, but of course spent a lot more in the UK, having a black hole at $732 billion. Yep. But given those figures of the differences of the size of the state in Scotland and the UK, both in spend and raising powers, just what type of changes does he think would have to hit welfare before welfare became destabilising to the Union? Yep. I would suggest you'd have to make millionaires out of each and every person who's unemployed before you'd reach that point.
Yep. I don't think it would need to go that far. And clearly, at the moment, there is a disproportion in the size of Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom, and so the budget figures, as he described, show that there's a lot more money collected elsewhere than there is in Scotland. But that isn't the point at issue. The point, and I'm only asking a question. I'm not asserting. I'm just asking a question, because we have this very crucial debate on how much welfare power goes to Scotland, and I'm one of those who agrees that some welfare power should go to Scotland in accordance with Smith, but we have to ask how far it goes and then what its consequences might be. Because if you have a common work area, a free movement area, sharing a language, sharing a labour market, sharing a currency, with the benefits that can bring when it's settled down because it's backed by a political union, when you start to unpick the political union, you have to ask yourself, at what point does that unpicking of the political union or the welfare transfer union become damaging? Because you would reach the point where it does become damaging, because then one part of the country would be too attractive or too unattractive compared with another part of the country. And the only way in which a single currency area as big as the United Kingdom can possibly work is if there are fair systems for raising money from the rich wherever they are in that big area and giving enough money to the poor wherever they are. I give way.
The honourable gentleman for giving way. Is he aware that it's already a situation where there are parts of the UK that are more unattractive because of decisions that are made on welfare spend? For example, the bedroom tax. In the Highlands, there are some 70 communities with no 1 or 2 bedroom properties in the social register for people to move to. How can it possibly be fair that principle applies across the UK, where there is no ability for the people that live there to actually cope with that heinous tax.
One size fits all.
I fully understand the arguments against the spare room subsidy or the bedroom tax and understand the politics of it only too well. And I don't wish to go into my private views on that at the moment. But that is a matter to be settled within the Union Parliament and by the Government of the Union under current powers. And it doesn't make good law to say that, well, because there is one particular benefit at the moment that people in Scotland don't like very much, that is the one we should then be able to fix. We need to come up with a settlement for a longer-term period which looks at the principles, which is why I'm just presuming to spend just a few minutes reminding colleagues that there are very big principles here and that you need to get the right balance between Scotland feeling it can make enough of its own decisions to meet the mood of the majority in Scotland, but fall short of giving so much power to Scotland that the Union's mechanisms for switching money around don't work. And I find it very difficult to make decisions on this bill today without knowing what the financial settlement would look like. Because none of this works unless there is enough money to make it work. And none of it works if England, in the end, doesn't think the financial settlement is fair to them, for example. And we may well find that Scotland doesn't think the financial settlement is fair to them. I'm sure SNP colleagues in the House won't be shy if they feel we reach that point when we see the financial settlement. But England, too, which has delivered big majorities for myself and many of my colleagues, have a mandate and a voice, and we need to make sure that the financial settlement that emerges is fair to us, and the range of powers that Scotland has will have a bearing on that financial settlement. Do you want to give it? Yeah.
Forgive me, he has been very kind, I've got to say. On the point he talks about of welfare, we have that situation actually already of a common travel area sharing a common language, and that's with the Republic of Ireland, where people can get up to €188 per week with extra payable for those who've got children. Now, I'm not saying people going from Liverpool or the north east of England to a far more advantageous situation in the Republic of Ireland, which they could do in the common travel area. So I think his fears are misplaced, and I would almost suggest that his fears are politically motivated in keeping powers at Westminster and some deep psychological need for Westminster to over-control aspects of people's lives around the current UK.
I'm afraid that's such a bad example because it proves my case. Ireland broke from the pound and set up their own currency, and then I think, unfortunately for them, they chose the euro, but that was their decision, and they've had a bumpy ride since they were in the euro. But the big difference, the thing we need to remind ourselves for this welfare debate is there is a common currency, and there has to therefore be some limits to the amount of freedom that is appropriate on welfare benefits. If the SNP now wish to be truly independent and want an independent currency, then of course I fully understand their position, and none of these arguments make any sense. Anyway, I think I made the point, and I just hope ministers will bear in mind that it is very difficult to conclude on this before we know what the actual financial settlement is going to be. And it's also very important that we remember that there is a common work area, a common language area, a common currency area, which means that there has to be some family resemblance in the benefits that are paid.
Mark Durkin.
Thank you, Mr Crosbie. I just want to follow on from some of the issues that have been touched on by the Right Honourable Member for Wickham. In particular, in the last point that he raised, he talked about the issue of what he called financial settlement, and earlier in an intervention he asked the Secretary of State on the earlier clauses and amendments if the Secretary of State would address what adjustment might be made to the Barnett formula. And in essence, I think the Right Honourable Member for Wickham is actually corroborating some of the very basic questions that were asked by the Honourable Member for Banff and Buchan about these two clauses, because these two clauses, by their nature, presume an awful lot and leave a lot of questions about what other language should be in the clauses and also what else is happening offside from them. Because clauses 24 and 25 are written in ways that presume a standard of behaviour, that presume courses of actions and events in relation to how decisions will be taken. For instance, the word concurrently is used. But then when you look at the sequence of decisions and processes that would be involved, it doesn't look very concurrent to me. Things could happen in a very distended period of time with a lot of dispute and difference going on. And of course, the most important gap in clauses 24 and 25 as they appear, which is why the amendments from honourable members, both the opposition front bench and from the SNP, are trying to address those, is it doesn't say what happens if Scottish ministers and the Secretary of State do not actually concur on some of these issues. And one of the most basic questions for legislators, if we're going to bring clauses that presume standards and presume courses of events and political behaviour, the basic question for legislators is, and what if not? And there is no answer here to what if not. If there isn't agreement, if the consultation that's described either by Scottish ministers with the Secretary of State one way, or in the other instance by the Secretary of State with Scottish ministers, if they do not concur on these decisions, on the timelines, on the details, on the other implications, what then happens? Because then we will have difficulty. And then we will be told, well, the legislation faithfully followed Smith and we couldn't do any more than that. But it's quite clear that Smith is not of itself sufficient to address these questions, and we as legislators have to address those questions. The exercise of the Smith Commission was a different class of exercise than we have responsibility for as legislators, and it is not good enough for us as legislators to then say, well, we're not answering those obvious questions. Because it wasn't addressed in Smith. And I speak from experience of having been through a Northern Ireland process where we negotiated agreement after agreement, where we had lots of developments, and of course quite often government would say, both parties would say, we're faithfully implementing the agreement, and it was quite clear, and many of us were saying, it is not adequate to its purpose, more is needed than that. And of course we were proved right in those instances, and so I feel a lot of empathy with Scottish colleagues here who are saying that it's not enough to say that this faithfully implements Smith when it doesn't answer what are practical and basic fundamental questions. And it's not enough for us to say, well, we'll see what happens, or we'll see who goes to the courts first in relation to some of these issues, because that does not give a proper answer in constitutional terms, nor does it give an answer that is edifying to the public in terms of giving politics any sort of good reputation if we end up with a situation where politicians end up basically blaming each other for their own powerlessness or for the fact that they are delivering that they are delivering confusion. And again, I speak from the current Northern Ireland experience in that regard, Mr Crosbie, because there we have an instance where, just like has been provided in this bill here, and particularly in clauses 24 and 25, there is an image of dual control in relation to the fact that there is a degree of devolution, but there is also then a degree of control at Westminster and Whitehall, but it will all be done swimmingly and smoothly. Yet the fact is, when it doesn't happen, we then have decisions not taken. We have politicians of different parties saying they want to take certain decisions but can't take them because of other things. And we have a blame game that goes around that doesn't do credit to any of the political institutions, and probably isn't doing credit to any of the parties. So I don't want to see the same sort of presumption being used in this legislation that ends up creating a crisis, because not only do we have words like concurrently used whenever the processes aren't very concurrent, we also have this idea that the Secretary of State can give agreement, and such agreement not to be unreasonably withheld. Well, if it's who decides what's unreasonable and whose judgment, what's the real motive behind what is happening? There are different views in the Northern Ireland situation as to who has been reasonable and who has been unreasonable in this situation. But to go back to the point that was touched on by the honourable member for Wokingham about financial settlements and the idea that there would have to be a test about is it fair to England. Of course, in the current Northern Ireland situation, we have what it was meant to be a devolved legislative decision on welfare has essentially been subject to a budget bullying exercise on the part of the Treasury, not the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, but on the part of the Treasury. And of course this bill is silent on the issue of the Treasury, and in my own view I think an amendment would be needed at report stage to precisely address what the role of the Treasury would be in these, or could not be, in these situations, because in essence the position that we have in Northern Ireland, and I know the form of devolution on paper on welfare in Northern Ireland at the minute isn't the same as has been proposed here, but the lesson is salient in this context, because there the karaoke legislative power that the Northern Ireland Assembly has to pass legislation, provided it meets the words and music passed by this House, has to be passed in those terms. Otherwise, we are now being told the Treasury says we will claw back your money, not the welfare spending. We will claw back the money for your devolved budget. So here we have the Treasury interfering in what was meant to be the known financial settlement in terms of the Barnett formula. And the honourable member for Wickham earlier asked the question about what was to happen in relation to the Barnett formula. He also used the very good question in relation to when it comes to devolving welfare, and he says he agrees with devolving aspects of welfare and he agrees with the Smith Commission on that. But he says the question has to be asked, how far does it go? And I believe that the amendments that are here from the opposition front bench and the Scottish National Party are about trying to clarify how far does it go, and making it clear from the start, and also making it clear what path is open to Scottish ministers and the Scottish Parliament. And I would prefer to see more about the Scottish Parliament in this legislation than all the references being to Scottish ministers, by the way, but that's another point. But the honourable member for Wokinham's question, how far does it go, is ending up not going to be answered by these clauses or by the government's rejection of the amendments. Instead, that question, how far does it go, is going to be answered on each and every occasion when the Secretary of State is asked how far can Scottish ministers go and can the Scottish Parliament go in relation to the available discretion for welfare spend. And there shouldn't be that constant political checkpoint on the Scottish Parliament and on Scottish ministers, whereby it falls to ministers here to decide how far does the devolution of welfare go when it comes to this decision, when it comes to the next decision, or when it comes to another, because that is going to be a recipe for permanent tension and contention. And I had thought that the purpose of the Smith Commission and the purpose of this Scotland Bill was to try to make sure that we were relieved from that, both in this House and in the Scottish Parliament, so that those people who want to address the discretion that will be available to the Scottish Parliament are then able to address the merits of the particular benefit changes and the particular benefit innovations they want to bring forward, whether it's benefits that specifically address the position of cancer sufferers, so that there can be a specific cancer support allowance to cut through a lot of the confusion there are with the other benefits, and with employment support allowance. It could be done in an effective way. Let people address those issues in terms of how benefits can be made work to deal with the real problems that real people have in Scotland, and maybe set very good examples for the rest of us. That's what people should be empowered and emancipated to concentrate on with the devolution that we pass. Not be constantly waiting for where's the political crisis, where's the political fallout, what political gamesmanship is being played either by ministers in London or accused of ministers in Scotland in relation to a matter as fundamental as welfare. Because nothing scandalises the public more than when they believe that issues as fundamental as welfare, particularly for people with disabilities and serious long-term conditions, has become a political football. And again, we see that sense of scandal in Northern Ireland, and I don't want to see it repeated anywhere else as well. And that's why the Secretary of State needs to listen to the point of these amendments, because it's not about political points. It's not about political points. It's a matter of making sure that people, when they address these issues in future in Scotland, in the spirit in which this devolution is meant to be extended, can debate those issues and those ideas without having to feel that they're getting into some sort of serious political quicksand that is about devolution. Are they going to trigger off a demand for another referendum, or are they going to get into something else? Let it be that they can put forward their own ideas to the Scottish Parliament to best use these powers without feeling that they are coming into any other awkward situation other than putting forward ideas and proposals for the betterment of their people. That would be the Scottish Parliament working better. It will mean this Parliament would be free of arguments and contentions that it doesn't need to bother itself with, and it would also be a very good example for the rest of us who need to sort out our alignment of devolution in terms of welfare as well. And I don't want to go back into our own situation, but I'm not saying that what is proposed in this bill should automatically be translated to Northern Ireland, and while I support most of the amendments that are here, I couldn't pretend that all of the new clauses would necessarily work in the context of Northern Ireland or be applicable. There would be differences there, obviously, so I'm not wishing to presume. But let's get this devolution right, and let then the Scottish Parliament have the chance to get welfare right in their terms. That will be no risk, no threat to this Parliament, and it would certainly be an example to the rest of us.
Sir Edward Lee.
Mr Crosbie, I beg to move new clause 55 in part 2 of Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act, leave out head F, Social Security. And what that means, according to the explanatory statement which has been put down in the order paper, is that this new clause will remove from the list of reserved matters in the 1998 Act and so transfer to the Scottish Parliament all social security schemes, including national insurance and housing benefit, as well as child support, occupational and personal pensions and war pensions. I agree, as I said yesterday, these are complex matters, so I put this forward as a probing amendment to try and elicit from the government front bench exactly their thoughts on this vital matter. But may I start by perhaps making a controversial statement? I believe that by dribbling out powers, and this is not my own phrase, it was given to me by one of my Scottish friends, I still have one or two Scottish friends left, we are giving, I think, the SNP a crowbar to blast the union apart. Just enough purchase on that crowbar, just enough powers given away by this Parliament to feed a sense of grievance. And I think if we were to give the Scottish Parliament full responsibility for social security, it would be very difficult for them to feed on that grievance. They would have to be a responsible Parliament taking responsible decisions, and I am confident that they would do so. So my amendment then is very clear. It would place all social security within Scotland in the hands of the Scottish Parliament, including pensions. Now, Scotland, of course, has a more ageing population than the UK. Immigration is much lower. I never understand why, but apparently it is. So Scotland, I think, would need a needs-based formula to protect the pensions of Scottish people. And that is precisely the argument I've been using through these debates, that if you have a needs-based formula, buttressing a Scottish Parliament with full fiscal autonomy, that would actually sustain the union. And therefore I would replace the Barnett formula with a needs-based formula to protect pensions in Scotland and an ageing population. That is where I'm coming from. I'm sorry, Mr Crosbie, I know we're not very far yet in this Parliament, and I do feel that perhaps I'm wearying now my colleagues by making the same point over and over again. But I think it's important to make these points. I mean, there isn't a huge number of colleagues here present, but I recall from reading my history books that during the Government of India Bill debates, day after day, the House of Commons was debating these matters, and people like Harold Macmillan and Brendan Bracken and Winston Churchill were making the same points over and over again, that by dribbling out powers to India, you were destroying the connection of India with the United Kingdom. And there were very few people listening to them. Now, I don't claim that I'm in any way of that league of people or anything, but I think these debates are absolutely important. And this contention that you could actually destroy the union by not getting this right is an important point that must be debated. Yes, of course.
I'm very grateful for his allowing me to intervene. It's quite interesting to hear him talk about India and the angst that was palpable in this chamber about connections with India. Doesn't he think that one day the angst that is currently there, of admittedly not much of the Labour and Tory benches, given the amount of them that are actually here, but the angst that is shown as they vote against the wishes of 95% of the Scottish MPs who want X, Y and Z in the Scotland Bill, the angst will go someday, and it will go when the powers come out of here, and the members of England can worry about the matters of England rather than worry about the matters of Scotland.
I do say this, that I think we have to act responsibly, and we have to remember that, unfortunately, we only have 3 unionist MPs left in Scotland. and the SNP has won a notable victory in Scotland, and I do think they do need to be listened to. Doesn't mean we have to always agree with them, but we have to listen to them, because ultimately I am as passionate a unionist as anybody on these benches, but I believe that there is a better route to maintain the union. And I think that if we dribble out these powers, we are making a grave mistake. Now, let me deal with this point, that if you have a single currency system, then you must have a common welfare system. This is a perfectly respectable point. I completely understand it. It was made by my honourable friend for Somerset North East in the debates 2 weeks ago. It's been made extremely well by my right honourable friend for Wokingham. And I understand where they're coming from, and we're all very much aware of the Greek situation. But I would argue that the comparison is a misplaced one, that the difference between Germany and Greece is infinitely greater than the difference between England and Scotland. In the United States, full fiscal autonomy for the states works because there is a common English language, there is full mobility of labour, and therefore when you get these disparities in wealth, labour moves around the United States in a very vigorous way, which is very difficult to achieve in the European Union. So I think, and I have to say that I think the comparison of Scotland and England with the Netherlands and Germany is a much more apposite comparison. You know, a common language, common border, very similar systems, albeit separate legal systems, but based in many of the same traditions. You can understand the point I'm making. Now, of course, if the Scottish Parliament was to act completely irresponsibly and was to take control of its social security and just spend, then the thing would break apart. I agree that the currency union would become unsustainable. But surely, as parliamentarians, having confidence in our own parliament and our own elected representatives, surely should we not have the same confidence in our fellow countrymen and ladies who will be running the Scottish Parliament? And I personally believe that if you gave them full responsibility, they would have to act responsibly if they wish to get re-elected. So, I mean, that's a perfectly respectable point made by my honourable friends, and the Minister will want to deal with it, and no doubt he will be agreeing with them and making that point. But I do think that it is possible, within a currency union, if you share similar traditions, if you have a similarly incorrupt system, you can have different welfare systems. So let's look at actually what's been given. This is a bit of detail now, but it's quite important. Within its remit, the Scottish Parliament transformed social fund community care grants and crisis loans into the social welfare fund, while council tax benefit was replaced with council tax reduction. So there have been some changes already. In addition to this, Holyrood is in charge of discretionary housing payments within Scotland. Now, the point is, and the point I'm making is that all of these benefits together amount to just £422 million in 2013-14. That's less than 2.4% of all welfare spending in Scotland. And if my calculations are correct, and I may be wrong, less than 0.21% of all welfare spending in Great Britain. Such is the disparity of spending in Scotland and the United Kingdom as a whole. It is inconceivable that decisions made in the Scottish Parliament would upset the balance of payments in the United Kingdom as a whole. So, of course, I welcome the government's move to expand Scotland's control of its own benefits. We all do. The debate now is about how much we should do it. But I want to ask ministers, why aren't we devolving the job lot of it? That's the question I'm asking. How can you effectively half-run welfare? It comes as a package. Is that not actually the point of the universal credit? But actually universal credit can't stand alone, so you can't start dribbling out powers but keep universal credit. I think we are making a mistake. But it's an arguable point, so the Minister may be able to knock down my arguments, and so I put them forward with a sense of humility. One of the arguments for having uniformity benefits is that it supports a common social citizenship across the Union. Now, this is the point made by the Honourable Gentleman who leads for the opposition. I think that's a perfectly fair point. He says that we believe in this common social citizenship, and so I accept that. But I do believe that this argument has been broken in such important regards as tuition fees, for instance, and prescription charges. So I'm not entirely sure why we have a common social citizenship, which is argued very well by the honourable gentleman who leads for the opposition in these debates, why that's important for that, but it's not important for tuition fees. Now, there's also the argument that the social security system is so immeasurably complex and interconnected, with decisions in one area having vast implications and repercussions elsewhere, that devolving it would be virtually impossible or unachievable. Now, if anything, this bolsters the case, I would have thought, for universal credit. But is it not possible that Scotland, in charge of social security for over 5 million people, might innovate its system, might simplify its system, might even provide models for the rest of the United Kingdom? And do we not believe in competing social security systems throughout Europe? Do we not believe that we have a right to have a different, and actually, let's make the analogy better, does not Holland, for instance, believe that it can have a competing social security system with Germany, but it can maintain its independence? As I said, the proposals at hand are a step in the right direction, but I do not believe that they go far enough. In 2013-14, the expenditure in Scotland on the benefits the Smith Commission proposed devolving totaled less than £2.6 billion. This is out of £16 to £17 billion of welfare in Scotland. True, it's more than the current £422 million, so we're making progress. But the Scottish Government does not believe it's enough, and I think they have got a point which we should at least listen to and argue with and knock down their arguments if they are not sustainable. Given the very strong mandate the electorate has given to the SNP, I do think that we have to listen to some of their arguments and deal with them in a constructive way. So, of course, as a Conservative, I believe in evolution, not revolution. But I also believe in learning from history. And I made this point before, that we failed before because we were too afraid of taking the plunge and trusting people. Today, I do think we need to think of grand gestures, not just this benefit and that welfare payment. The way to secure Scotland's place in the Union is to grant her full fiscal autonomy, full fiscal responsibility and full home rule in the modern sense. I hope ministers, they're all good unionists just like I am, will explain their thinking in not going down the route that I am proposing. This, I believe, is a way to keep our family and nations happy together. And that is what my amendment seeks to move closer to achieving. And I'll end up with this point, Mr Crosbie. I fear that we are trying to counter nationalism with fear and fudge, and that never works. We will only counter nationalism with hope and aspiration. In the United Kingdom as a whole, 70% of people support benefit reform. Universal credit, which I support, will make a difference. But given the overwhelming importance of welfare in a modern parliamentary system, no self-respecting parliament worth a name cannot take full accountability for welfare payments. I hope and expect that the Scottish Parliament would keep universal credit if they were given the chance. But that should be a matter for them. And it is in that spirit, Mr Crosbie, that I move my new clause.